I have a 6 p.m. My recommendation is to be able to begin our council meeting, and Ricky informed me that we're ready to stream.
Okay, I'd like to call the North Augusta City Council May 17, 2021 meeting to order. Item 2, Invocation Pledge of Allegiance. You are welcome to join me in prayer. Dear God, I lift up this council to you, Lord, so we will have discernment in our decisions, open hearts and ears to what we hear from each other and citizens, and a resolve as we do the work of the city. Amen. Amen. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. Item 3, roll call. We'll just start from the far left. If you would just state your name so we can have it on the record.
Eric Presnell.
Patsy Carpenter.
Britton Williams.
Bob Brooks.
Jennifer McCauley.
Kevin Toole.
Very good. And I'll just note that Councilman McGee is not with us tonight. Item 4, approval of minutes. Do we have any additions, deletions, or corrections for the study session and council meeting on May the 3rd and the study session on May the 10th? If not, they stand approved as distributed. Okay, item 5, proclamation, Public Works Week. Public Works Week. I will read this in its entirety. Whereas public works professionals focus on infrastructure, facilities, and services that are of vital importance to sustainable and resilient communities and to the public health, high quality of life, and well-being of the people of North Augusta. And whereas these infrastructure, facilities, and services could not be provided without the dedicated efforts of public works professionals who are engineers, managers, and employees at all levels of government and the private sector who are responsible for rebuilding, improving, and protecting our city's transportation, water supply, water treatment, sanitary and stormwater, sewage and solid waste systems, public buildings, and other structures and facilities essential for our citizens. And whereas it is the public interest for the citizens, civic leaders, and children in North Augusta to gain knowledge of and maintain an ongoing interest and understanding of the importance of public works and public works programs in the community. And whereas the year 2021 marks the 61st annual National Public Works Week sponsored by the American Public Works Association. Now, therefore, I, Britton S. Williams, Mayor of the City of North Augusta, South Carolina, do hereby proclaim the week May the 16th through the 22nd of 2021 as Public Works Week in the City of North Augusta, and I urge all citizens to pay tribute to our public works professionals and to recognize the substantial contributions they make protecting our health, safety, comfort, and quality of life. In witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the City of North Augusta, South Carolina to be affixed the 17th day of May, 2021. Okay, at this time, Mr. Clifford, you want to, we're for the finance, bring Ms. Hayes up for that.
Yes, Mr. Mayor. So we've asked for permission for Mayor and Council to make a presentation today to be able to provide for you the initial findings from our audit review for the fiscal year ending December 31st, 2020. This is to inform the Council and our citizens about the overall health of our books, how we do our financial processes, and to be able to give you an outside look with an outside audit firm to give you and our citizens the confidence that our taxpayer money is well looked after. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cammie and her team, and we'll go ahead and hear from our finance group.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me here tonight. Like it was mentioned, we got this presentation here before us. First thing I'll mention is this is the first year that we've performed the city's external audit. Very positive process from our perspective, and I do have to note that the audit is, as of the making of this presentation, had not yet been issued, and we are going over a draft version of numbers. But we have completed our quality control review actually this afternoon, so we'll be dating our report today, but we are going through draft numbers. But I'm happy to say that the numbers will not change. The formatting will look a lot better in the ultimate document. But hopefully this presentation will provide a visual aid to you all to go through some of these things and help in looking at those numbers. And again, we are confident the numbers will not change at this point. So with that, I'm just going to jump into the presentation here, and this is just a brief overview of the purpose of the presentation today, and that is to tell you a little bit about who we are as a firm, to go through the draft document and its numbers there, including some financial highlights, and then answer any potential questions that you all may have. If you do have any questions, please just stop me at any point in time, and I'd be happy to try to address those as we go. This is just a little bit about who we are as a firm. Malden Jenkins has been around about 100 years. We employ about 320 personnel. We provide about 340,000 hours a year in service to our clients, and a third of that is governmental work. So audits of governmental entities are about 30%. We audit about 550 state and local governments across the Southeast. That includes, specifically relevant to North Augusta, about 20 cities in the state of South Carolina, ranging in size from some of the very smallest to some of the largest. The city has, as a practice, received or submitted and then ultimately received the GFOA certificate for achievement in financial reporting, 38 years, I believe, in a row for that, tied for a record in the state. But we have similar experience with a number of clients, have almost 140 clients that get that award. So significant experience in administering and making sure that that award is achieved year after year for our clients. Just after that, on the following slide, you'll see that we're ultimately going to issue an opinion on these financial statements, and it's the city is responsible for the document itself. It's responsible for the numbers and everything in it. Our job is to express an opinion on those financial statements, which we ultimately will do, and we have conducted our audit in accordance with governmental accounting standards and generally accepted audited standards, which are those two acronyms that you can see on that slide there. Just after that, and you'll notice that this is not present in the draft document, but in the final that you'll get, there's a section that's entitled Management's Discussion and Analysis. If I would suggest one element of that document for you to read, over 100 pages of information, I would suggest the 10 pages of that Management's Discussion and Analysis section. The reason for that is it provides you with a basis for reading the financial statements in its elements, how to understand it. It is relatively complex. Provide some highlights, financial highlights for the year. Maybe the more important thing, especially in light of COVID this past year, is you'll be able to provide or compare 2020 to 2019. See how things changed, see how revenues either increased or decreased, how expenditures either increased or decreased. Similarly, assets, liabilities, equity, so forth. You can also see that there'll be some debt analysis that's comparative 2019 to 2020 and capital assets as well. And then lastly, there's some economic factors that were currently known at the time of the date of financial statements, which was December 2020, and the year that we're in now, an analysis of its budget at that point. So just a few financial highlights from the statements themselves. You can see here $268 million in total assets of the city, which includes all funds and functions. About $45 million of that is cash, both restricted and unrestricted. There are some small restricted portions of cash associated with debt service and things like that. Of that 268 million, about another 3.4 represents various receivables in the forms of taxes receivable, other accounts receivable, intergovernmental receivables, and those are net of an allowance as it is applicable. And of course, the biggest portion of the total assets are capital assets. These are things like infrastructure, vehicles, buildings, things of that nature, and those are shown net of accumulated depreciation. And of course, you can see there at the last bullet, overall total assets of the city are up $12.7 million over 2019. The following slide is just a continuation of that statement of net position, which is ultimately a balance sheet. $133 million in total liabilities. 7.7 million of that 133 are what's considered current or due within a year. A further breakdown of that current portion, you have accounts payable, which are amounts due to outside vendors, things like that, for services and products, about $2 million. And then the current portion of long-term debt, so the current portion of your capital leases or of your bonds or various other financing instruments that are going to be due in the next year and due in 2021 is representative of that 3.6 million. 124.5 million represent long-term liabilities. 97 million of that big total, or relatively speaking big total, are what I'll call financing obligations. These are bonds, notes receivable, geo bonds, revenue bonds, capital leases, and then about 27 million of that total is the city's proportionate share of the state pension liability, which is obviously a very significant number, but sort of is what it is. Liabilities in total are up about 11.7 million from 2019, and a breakdown of that is bonds had a net increase, bonds outstanding of about $8 million, so there was a 10.2 million geo bond issuance minus any debt service payments on existing bonds, so you got a net increase in bonds about $8 million, and then about a $2 million increase in the pension liability from 2019 to 2020. The last section of the balance sheet there, the statement net position, is net position or equity, $135 million in equity. The most significant portion of that is called the net investment in capital assets, which is simply capital assets minus any outstanding debt that was issued to acquire those assets. And then restricted net position, 16 million, and those you can see there are various restrictions for debt service, capital projects, and things like that. That leaves us with an unrestricted deficit or a negative equity in that line item of 7.5 million, and that number actually declined. It's a little hard to say this when they're in the right way, but there was a deficit or a negative equity of about $8 million last year, $8.5 million in 2019. That has declined to a deficit of about $7.5 million. So that is an improvement in that deficit. And most places have a deficit unrestricted net position simply as a result of having to quantify the pension liability in about 2015. That added obviously a very significant liability to the books of all governments that participate in pension plans, and the city's obviously no different. So if you want to look at that from a comparative perspective, and you can even look in the statistical section in the final document and see how that's changed over time, but you can simply add the pension liability to that negative 7.5 and see where you were comparatively speaking to prior 2015. So anyway, nothing to be overly concerned about in my mind, given that significant pension liability that's there. Just after that, we'll kind of go over to some general fund highlights. General fund had about $5.5 million in assets, and almost $5 million of that represents cash. There are some various receivables also in that total. About $1.5 million in liabilities, and $923,000 of that's accounts payable. $563,000 is other short-term liabilities like accrued salaries, things of that nature. Ultimately, the general fund reported fund balance of $3.8 million at the end of 2020, which was an increase from 2019 to 2020 of $385,000, almost $400,000 in increase in fund balance. Just some additional flavor on that fund balance number. About $3 million of that total is what's called unassigned, so it's not restricted or committed by this council or any outside body. It can essentially be spent at your discretion. If we look at fund balance as a comparison to the general fund's expenditures this past year, the general fund had a little over $18 million in expenditures, if I'm remembering right. And if we compare that to the $3.8 million in fund balance, that means fund balance represents about 21% of the general fund's expenditures, or about 2.5 months of fund balance on hand. And that's certainly not a bad place to be coming out of this COVID year, so to speak. Beyond that, we've got the income statement for the general fund, and you can see 17 million in revenues. That was a decline from 2019 of about 734,000, and as you would expect, the significant declines ultimately were things that were halted due to COVID. I mean, you think the recreation programs were obviously significantly impacted, especially given the January to December year end. You all got 9 months of COVID, whereas your other similar cities and counties that have a June year end only would have reported 3 months of that activity in their most recently audited year. So anyway, a decline in revenues, but also a decline in expenditures. So adjusting to that environment is evident in that expenditures were down 1.3 million from 2019 to about $18.3 million. There are some other items in the general fund's income statement. Transfers between funds. The general fund reported a net transfer in of monies from other funds, about 875. That shouldn't say million. That would be significant. $875,000. Capital lease proceeds of about 608,000. So just money in for capital leases to buy equipment, infrastructure, and then again, the general fund reported change in fund balance of about $385,000. Just after that, we can, just a further picture, you look at the general fund's budget, and the budgeted numbers that I've included here are final or as amended budget numbers, not as they were originally adopted. So you can see there were significant budget adjustments from as adopted to as amended later on, but the general fund had budgeted revenues as amended of about 17.1 million. Actual realized or recognized revenues are about $17.2 million. So a positive revenue variance in terms of the budget about $153,000. Similar story with expenditures. As amended, the expenditure budget was about 18.4 for the general fund. Actual expenditures were 18.3. So a little less than $100,000 positive variance again in terms of expenditures. And then that other section that includes the items like transfers between funds, capital lease proceeds, all that kind of thing. Had a budget to bring in $1.3 million from those sources, actually brought in $1.5 million. So another positive variance. So no matter which way you look at the general fund's budget, it was positive in all aspects. And that's obviously what you would want to see in an evolving situation in the COVID year where the budget was amended continually to adapt to circumstances that were unforeseen at its adoption. This is just a chart of the general fund's revenues by breakdown. And of course, you can see the biggest piece of the pie is property taxes, and that's not atypical. And then followed by things like licenses and permits, and then beyond that, you get into the smaller pieces of the pie. So anyway, this is just sort of a visual to help you see where your revenues are coming from. Very similar thing here with the expenditures. You can see purple there. Again, not atypical. Just under 50% of the total expenditures, maybe 40% public safety related, which are police and fire. And then another significant portion general government, which includes things like administration and other matters like that. So again, just maybe a little visual to show you there on expenditures. This is essentially just historical inflows and outflows of financing and monies relative to the general fund. And you can see the general fund for the last 5 years has been pretty much right on line with each other. Some years revenues or inflows are a little higher than outflows. Some years it's inverted, but not a lot of variation there in terms of that. And obviously another good thing, especially in light of COVID. The biggest thing that I think is interesting, at least to me, is this one. This is the net change in fund balance of the general fund for the last 5 years. So you can see in 2019, the immediate preceding year, the general fund experienced a decline in its fund balance of $450,000 versus this year, 2020, our COVID year, having an actual increase in fund balance of almost $400,000. So, a very positive adjustment and adaptation to the environment that we were all involved in this past year relative to that. So again, just something to look at. These last couple slides with financial highlights are all relative to what I'm calling the BT funds, or the business type funds. These are the water and sewer utility, the sanitation, stormwater, Savannah Bluff Lock and Dam, even though it doesn't have a lot of activity, are all included here. And just again, a few highlights. About $103 million in assets for these activities combined. About 19.1 million of that's cash, and that cash position was overall among all activities an increase of almost $720,000 from 2019. So a significant ability to generate cash by these activities, even in light of COVID, which was good. We were a little, honestly, not specific to North Augusta, but we were a little worried as an industry perspective when the governor issued the moratorium on cutoffs, how long that would last, how that would implement or impact repayment ultimately. And there were a lot of entities that reached longer term repayment plans, but you can see it didn't ultimately impact the cash flows. The cash still was coming in, and of course that needs to be spent on infrastructure and things of that nature. $31.2 million in liabilities, about 3.2, or a very small portion of that, is current. So again, due in 1 year, and then the rest of it's long term. These are things like, these funds are all allocated a piece of the pension liability as well, but specifically the water and wastewater system have state revolving loan notes, outstanding debt associated with some infrastructure. There's some capital leases outstanding as well, and then you can see $72 million in equity or net position, which was a $1.6 million increase from 2019. This is just the income statement of the business type funds. You know, again, $17.3 million in operating revenues. That was a decline of almost 8% from 2019. But still, we saw the ability to generate cash. And then $15.7 million in operating expenses. Those were up a little bit, about $513,000 or 3% from 2019. But all in all, a positive change in net position of $1.6 million, which was up a little over $900,000 or 135% from 2019. So a very good year for the business type activities. This is all cash flows. You know, any business is super focused on the ability to generate cash, and these activities are no different. I won't go through all this just because you may be getting tired of me by now, but you know, what I will mention, the city purchased capital assets of almost $2 million with the cash that was generated from these activities, which exhibits a reinvestment in the infrastructure of these activities, which is obviously very important, especially as it relates to water and wastewater. And again, just to mention, there was an increase in cash of about $720,000 from 2019, and that was a 37% increase. Here's just another visual, or inflows sort of versus outflows. You know, down at the very far right, you can see the Savannah Bluff locking dam with not very much activity, but the others you can see an operating margin that is an income position with these here. We did have a recommendation. I mentioned this in our meeting prior to this council meeting with the mayor and management. Just due to its nature, I'm not going to go into any more detail in a public setting, but if you all have any questions, ultimately, then I will be happy to talk about it at that time. Just beyond that, so when we issue our audit here in probably the next week, we will have some required communications that will be memorialized in a document that we provide to you all. Things like we're independent of the city. We didn't have any disagreements with management in performing the audit, all those types of things. And again, those will all be documented in written form and provided to you all. The following slide, you can see there, we expect, when I did this, we expected to issue a clean opinion. We know we're going to have a clean opinion. It will be unmodified, and that doesn't sound great, but that's really the only acceptable result in a financial statement audit. Just beyond that, there's some new accounting standards that are going to come out. You know, each year GASB issues essentially a new standard that has sometimes no impact and sometimes significant impact to governments, and that's not going to change anytime soon. So lots of new changes and new things coming up. And then just after that, we're happy for any questions you might have or not, for that matter.
Any questions from council for Grant?
Other than we look like we're in pretty good shape then.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I think relative to the year and obviously the challenges that were faced, it'd be interesting to see what happens in 2021. I think everybody's going to be interested to see that. But I think, you know, especially with the activities that I mentioned here today, specifically focused on the general fund and those enterprise funds, everything looks great. And there's nothing in any of the other activities of the city that warranted mention in the meeting before you all as some area of concern. think everything looks great. And, you know, I will say this, we were able to start our audit field work in February, which was less than 60 days after your year end. And it's very difficult to have all your ducks in a row, to have auditors come in here and begin looking at your records within 60 days of your year end. So, it was a very positive experience for us, and I think that just speaks well to the management and staff here at the city, and of course, obviously, your leadership as well, and having people in place that can do their job to the extent that they can have us that quick begin to audit their work. So,
Thank you.
Done a very good presentation tonight.
thanks.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Under the liabilities, such as lease purchase, I noticed some of the accounts were over. Is that because of the lease purchase being assigned to those accounts?
I may have to punt to Cammie on this, but let me see if I can find it, and I'll see what I can figure out. You mean the budget overages
Yes.
associated with the lease purchase? Yeah.
Yes.
Let's see. Well, I mean, the ones that I see specifically as it relates to lease payments are relatively small.
It's the lease purchase, I believe.
Okay. Capital outlay seems to be a little higher than anticipated. I'm not really sure why that is. Do you have any thoughts?
So the way that we do our budget when it's annually adopted is we budget for our lease payments versus budgeting for the purchase of a piece of capital outlay. And then when the statements are prepared, that's changed to show that we actually purchase a piece of capital equipment versus just the lease payment of that piece of equipment. So every year you'll see that those items typically show over budget, but then there's a section in the notes where we go in and try to explain that it's because of the capital lease purchasing and the way we do our budget.
Okay, thank you.
Those, just some flavor. Those capital leases are almost non-cash in that, you get approved for a lease to buy an asset for the amount that you're going to spend for the most part, so that your inflows and your outflows should match up ultimately. And for the purposes of the financial statements, instead of netting that activity, we've grossed it up to show the expense for buying the asset, but also to show the inflow where the lease proceeds came in to purchase that. So that seems to be what the variance is about.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Well, I just want to commend Cammie, all the directors and staff for what you did in a tough year. I think you've seen what Grant has shown, what a fantastic job everybody did. So we're very thankful for that. So thank you for your time, Grant.
Yes, sir.
Okay, item 7, Mayor Pro Tem selection by council. In Section 2-31 of the North Augusta Code entitled Mayor Pro Tem, we will elect a member as Mayor Pro Tem for a term of 2 years. It shall be the duty of the Mayor Pro Tem to act as mayor during the absence or disability of the mayor in case of a vacancy in the office of mayor. At this point, I would open the floor for nominations for Mayor Pro Tem.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to nominate Bob Brooks.
I'll second that nomination.
Okay, so we have Mr. Councilman Presnell nominating Bob Brooks. Okay, are there any other nominations? Okay, nominations are closed, and then if you would raise your hand in favor as Mayor Pro Tem. And I believe that is unanimous.
Mr. Mayor, I will recuse myself from voting.
Well, I take that back. All but one. So Mayor Pro Tem is Councilman Bob Brooks. Congratulations, Bob. Item 8, zoning. Ordinance number 2021-05 to amend the zoning map of the city of North Augusta, South Carolina by rezoning plus or minus 51.20 acres of land owned by Aiken County Board of Education, Aiken County tax parcel number 023-05-01-003 from PD Plan Development to P, Public Use. This will be a first reading. Do I have a motion to consider this ordinance?
So moved.
I have a motion from Councilman Carpenter,
I'll second it.
a second from Councilman Brooks. Okay. Mr. Clifford, is there anything you want to tell us about this that we don't already know?
Mr. Mayor, for the council and also for our citizens watching tonight, this is an action that came through the Planning Commission with a recommendation for the council to approve, and this is allowing the Aiken County school systems to be able to put an elementary and a middle school, the Highland Springs Elementary Middle School, at that location. So in order to do that, we have to have that Zone P for public use. For those of you unfamiliar with that area, that's east of 520. There's a large open tract of land, and so this is on the southern end of that tract, and that's based on utility sightings. And in our discussion with the Aiken County School Superintendent King Lawrence, that they're prepared to move forward on this, and I believe that they'll do so here in the near future. So I think this is a good move forward for the city, and our staff recommendation is to approve it, as is the Planning Commission's. Subject to any of your questions or comments.
So you, Jim, so you have had discussions. I mean, they're almost ready to move forward with it.
I think they're waiting on us for the movement. I wouldn't say they're going to put a shovel in the dirt, Councilman, after you go ahead and approve this. But this is, one of the steps that we have to take at the city level in order for the county to be able to proceed. And again, I think this is a net benefit for our citizens and their children as we go forward. So
Yes, sir.
I don't have a great time for you. I can't give you a hard timeline today.
Right.
But I do know that this is required in order for them to move forward.
Now, the school board actually owns this land, though, correct? We're doing it on behalf of the school board?
I believe that's correct, Councilman.
Okay.
Councilman President, we did ask that question on the Planning Commission, so.
Okay,
they're-
so it
they're
is the school
moving
board that
forward.
owns
They're
it.
moving forward.
Okay. Well, just understand where I'm coming from, because
No,
every
I
time we've done
understand.
something, Pete, before, it's been for the city, not for someone else. That's why I was just curious.
If there are no other questions for Mr. Clifford, I would ask, are there any citizen comments? Okay. Any other discussion from council? Okay. Then we will take a vote. All in favor for adding this to first reading? Raise your hand. And I believe that's unanimous. Thank you. Item 9, Parks, Recreation, and Tourism. Recreation and Tourism. This is resolution number 2021-18, accepting a $15,205.50 donation from Tina Chugger for the construction of a gazebo off the Greenway and west of Center Street. Do I have a motion to approve this resolution? Councilman Presnell, is there a second?
I'll second.
Councilman McCauley. Okay. Mr. Clifford, anything you'd like to share about this?
Mr. Mayor, first of all, we appreciate the partnership with our citizens, and obviously this is a great opportunity for us to partner with one of our citizens on an improvement to our greenway. This is cited on the map as you have here on the screen on the west side of Center Street, just south of City Hall. And so ultimately this would be a great opportunity for us to be able to partner and to have a place where people can rest. I think Parks and Rec under Rick Meyer has been working this project for quite a period of time, making sure this thing is as aesthetically pleasing as possible from a design perspective. We think this is a good addition to the city, and again, the staff recommendation is that we be able to move forward on this.
Any questions for Mr. Clifford? Any citizen comments? Okay. Any other discussion from council? Okay, then let's take a vote. All in favor? And that is unanimous. Okay. Item 10, administrative reports. Anything
Mr. Mayor and Council, I have no administrative reports at this time. I believe we covered the material in the staff's study session of previous week.
Okay. We are now on item 11, presentation, communications, recognition of visitors. And I should have said it earlier, the few folks who are here, we thank you for being here as citizens, and the folks who are watching it from live stream. At this point, are there any comments from any citizens? Okay. Any final comments for council on anything we need to share before we adjourn? Okay. We stand adjourned.